I
You would.
Yeah. I'm not trying to like gratuitous. Yeah,
Right.
I care about this country. I think like as up as it is, and like as all the issues that we were talking about as far as macroeconomic headwinds and whatever, I want this thing this weird experiment to continue. I think it's a beautiful place to live. And if somebody was like, yeah, like some of that stuff you talked about, it's extremely low cost, thermonuclear 2.0 thing, like don't talk about. I'd be like, yeah, I'm not going to talk about it. But like, what's interesting is like I actually feel like I've become very close to truths in certain areas, and like it's just sort
like
of
where?
Have you seen my Townsend Brown episode?
No.
Oh,
is that the guy who the 26-year-old engineer?
No. This guy is a mid-century inventor. He's born in 1905, died in 1985, and he worked with like most of the kind of big aerospace companies. And then you have like all of these really interesting, credible witnesses around gravity experiments that he did with these asymmetric capacitors. So you have a negative charge plate, positive charge plate, neutral insulator in the middle. You pump the whole thing with kind of like megavolt range electricity, and you get this weird, this acceleration from the negative plate to the positive plate, even when the positive plate is faced upwards. So it's basically like ability to manipulate gravity through pure electromagnetism as the input. And, that would be this insane novel thing. And he claimed to replicate it in a vacuum chamber, which is like the main detraction on this experiment is that ion wind is causing the thrust. So if you're in a vacuum chamber, you don't have ion wind. And there are other variations of the experiment that involve negating the ion wind component. And like Edward Teller was a credible witness. I've met Townsend Brown's daughter, who talks about Edward Teller being in the room, freaking out around, saying, I don't know how this works, around Townsend Brown's fan precipitator experiment. You have this technical consultant at Wright-Patterson, or Wright Airfield at the time, named Victor Bertrandius, freaking out. You have Agnew Bonson, who forms the Institute of Field Physics and is funding Brown, but also doing funding the most frontier theoretical physics at the time and establishing quantum gravity. He says strange things happen at high megavoltage across short distances. He's clearly talking about Brown's experiments. And then the interesting way in which this ties into the UFO story is like that magnesium bismuth, we talked about in the Gary Nolan thing. So magnesium bismuth is this thing that Brown talks constantly about because it's a high K dielectric, meaning it stores a lot of electromagnetic charge. The higher the K factor on the material and the insulator in between the two capacitors, the greater the thrust you get. And so barium titanate, magnesium bismuth, a lot of these materials that come up in this interesting way around the UFO conversation are part of Brown's experiments and are in his like Winter Haven proposal. And so that could make you a cynic, and you could be like, oh, that's like, maybe it's all like cover for some gravity thing or whatever. But Brown himself was very trippy, and he would talk about being in touch with Space Brothers. And like
Space Brothers.
Yes. And like he and his daughter had a UFO experience. And he attributes a lot of his initial work and knowledge to a UFO experience he had on Catalina Island, which is a UFO hotspot.
The fucking Catalina wine mixer.
That it all started there.
It is a UFO. I just can never wrap my head around the fact that the Catalina wine mixer place is where there's a lot of UFO shit, but you're 100% right. It's
yeah. Somehow those two things go hand in hand. Yeah. So, and there's a good book called Undersea UFO Base by Preston Dennett, which documents all the, the crazy amount of UFO sightings in Catalina. So anyways, that would be an area where like that really wasn't super popular, the Brown stuff pre me cover. I mean, this great biographist guy named Paul Shatskin wrote a book on it called The Man Who Mastered Gravity. And that, my piece was in some ways an homage to that book. And I think there are all sorts of loose threads in areas where I've gone deeper on the book, and like I think there are weak areas of where we need more corroboration. I think he gets certain things wrong in spots, but if Townsend Brown, in the world in which UFOs are real, if you're telling me Townsend Brown wasn't part of the kind of legacy stuff, then I just don't believe then I think UFOs aren't real or something. It's like he has to be more involved than anybody, in my opinion.
But you're also saying in some of the research related to that, to bring it back to the beginning, you could be getting at some things that get a little interesting.
Well, yeah, because it's like if, and how in my interview with Hal Puthoff and Weinstein, Hal Puthoff's like, if we figured anything out in the maybe we did figure out some of the stuff in the world of gravity, but it went black. Or we didn't figure anything out. And he kind of like proposes these like funny, sort of thing. And if we did figure anything out, I think Brown was at the center of it. There might have been alternative, some other interesting things being researched, like microwave beam propulsion. There might be a couple of other, kind of ways to investigate this, but I think Brown was pretty, deep on this stuff.
But if you got hit up that some of these threads were getting close to national security, you're saying you'd back off.
Yeah. I mean, if I got, good rationale for it's like, hey man, like you don't want like,
yeah,
that, but the reason to not back off until that is that like, this has really important civil side, like our infrastructure's in decay. Our cities are like horrible. They suck. And going downhill despite $1 trillion infrastructure bills being passed. And we're not an interstellar, species. And, it would be awesome if we could and actually transcend the limits of SpaceX, which SpaceX is an amazing company, but it's really an Earth-based space company. It's space travel for, it's a Starlink and, maybe Moon or Mars if we're lucky. That's like after we get Starship to work, but we're not really going beyond that. And so like, I think this stuff is extremely important to explore. And so, yeah, until like I hear anything on that, then I think the logical thing is like move forward.
And I respect that a lot. I also respect the idea that like, as a patriotic American, if you felt like something was getting on the edge of where shit could get dangerous or there's blowback, you stop. Here's the catch-22 there, though, that's difficult. And my friend Joby Warrick, who I've had on a couple times, episode 134 and episode 198, he's two-time Pulitzer winner, long-time national security reporter at the Washington Post, just incredible journalist.
Yeah.
Wrote the book Black Flags in 2015 or 2016, which is about like the rise of ISIS and is the greatest book ever written on that, which won the Pulitzer. But like, I remember when he was in here for 134, when I was still in my parents' house, there was a conversation maybe like 50 minutes into there where we were talking about all the scenarios where what you're talking about happens exactly in the Washington Post room, in the national security room. And it is where their sources or representatives of the government come to them when they're working on a story they know about and they go, yo guys, if you report this, people are going to die.
The other problem that you might encounter at the end of this is something we actually get into all the time, is even after you've proved your case 6 ways to Sunday and no one can really deny it, you still have this sort of final interview with the CIA in which you're presenting what you're going to say, because they have every response. As we see it, they have they should be able to respond and say what they want to say. And often they will make an appeal to you as an American saying that if you write this story, you're going to get somebody in trouble, you're going to get somebody killed. And then it gives us pause, and we stop and we think, well, is that really true, or are they just kind of feeding us this line because they're going to be embarrassed? And often we'll negotiate. We'll say, okay, well, if there is a security issue, if there is a person at risk, we're willing to withhold certain facts. We're willing to, and that's a difficult decision for a journalist to make, but we see that as being responsible, that you don't just say something or report something because you know it. There's also, you do worry about human lives. And if you're going to compromise a security operation, we're not comfortable doing that. And so we'll modify the report in a way just to leave out certain details that might get somebody in trouble. And the one example where that's happened was the black site prisons that we talked about. There was a secret CIA program where they set up prisons around the world for interrogating members of Al Qaeda that they caught. And it was a top secret thing. Nobody knew that these prisons existed. It was outside to the judicial system. There's no accountability, no oversight.
What years are we talking about?
This was 2005 and 6. That's when the stories broke.
Got it.
And so the initial stories that we wrote, we knew where the prisons were, but we agreed in a negotiating process with the agency that we wouldn't say specifically where they were because there would be possibility of attacks on those facilities. You know, there was real danger for people if we pointed to specific facilities. So we left that out, and it was still a powerful story. We still revealed something we felt was very important for people to know about.
Yeah.
But we tried to do it in a responsible way, and that's just sort of the balancing act that we have to deal with sometimes.
And he talks about the impossible meeting that occurs there afterwards, where they have to ask themselves, do we believe them? Or do we think they're trying to cover for something and people aren't really going to die and they're trying to hold the dangle of human life over us so that we don't report this?
Yeah.
So if you start getting at some things that get really interesting, you know, I'm with you, and it's an impossible question to answer in your head that, like, there may be points where you stop, but you might have to ask the question sometimes where it's like, who's telling me this and why?
Yeah.
And maybe this is sketch.
Sure. Well, if they're doing it to protect oligopolistic interests or whatever, then I would just say the context in which you're operating as an oligopoly on, you know, whatever science or tech or whatever is going to go away because the U.S. is going to lose its kind of primacy in these areas. And so again, in the world in which you have, you know, some sort of arms race around this stuff, which is sort of, it's really dystopian even to like talk about and like frame it like that, but it's the world we live in. And if Carl Nell, again, is right that there is this sort of reverse engineering arms race, then you have the U.S. version, which, according to everybody in UFO world, has this corporatized, balkanized, fiefdom-based, left hand's not talking to the right hand. If you believe this Wilson memo thing that came out, you know, where this guy, head of the, you know, J2 Joint Chiefs, Thomas Wilson, who's, you know, in charge of all military technology, is meeting with Eric Davis and, you know, saying that he's meeting with this company and progress is very slow and cumbersome. And they exist outside of, you know, all normal, you know, security clearances. And, you know, they kind of understand some aspects of how these crafts fly, but they don't understand all of it or whatever. If you believe that, and if you believe, you know, Lockheed, Northrop, like all these sorts of companies like have like bits and pieces and they're not coordinating with each other, then you have to think that like the Russia-China version, it's just like fully nationalized. And they just have like their best and brightest scientists on this stuff.
Good point.
And if that's the case, it's like maybe we're cavemen and we have USB drives and the caveman has no idea what to do with the USB drive. You don't know information theory. You don't have a computer to plug it into. But maybe it's like Galileo with an iPhone, which like that Galileo's pretty smart. And maybe Galileo can open up the iPhone. The iPhone has a graphical interface. You can kind of touch it and like learn, you know, this action causes this reaction. And all of a sudden, you know, convergence as far as like ability to like use the thing gets much quicker. And like these, I have to like make these conjectures because I have no idea. Yeah. And nobody has any idea. But like to my knowledge, unless I'm living in some like Truman show, the smartest people I know like work at like, I don't know, like Anduril and Palantir and SpaceX and like, you know, these like new tech companies. They're not working at these older, stodgier, you know, like American primes. They're just not. You don't go to work at Boeing if you're like some super smart.
Allegedly.
What's that?
Allegedly.
I don't know how it works if it's being done like that covertly, you know. It's like the secrecy must be like so good, you know. And so like assuming like that mental model is correct, then like it's in a lot of these people's best interests to actually start to like share this stuff and like get in front of the topic. And I think that's been happening. And I think that explains actually a lot of the last, you know, 7 years of disclosure. But I think it's not maybe happening fast enough, or, you know, these companies aren't coordinating well enough. And so I think you just have to ask yourself that question. Is this are you being hushed because of like, you know, pure profit or whatever? But I'm skeptical of the idea that these things like are profit centers now. You know, I think in the world in which, again, these companies have like craft, I don't think we like understand fully how they fly. I think there are like real challenges to like working them fully. That would be my guess.
It also doesn't just have to be profit, though. There can be other variables that we could go on long tangents about that perhaps for stupid reasons they're just like, oh, the public can't know about that. And like, again, it comes down to a judgment call, and I don't envy that position. As far as I know,
no, I don't either.
I've never been in that position I don't think I have.
No, they were told by the CIA to like do the bidding, you know, to like you guys are like our plausible deniability as the U.S. government for being involved in this stuff. I think a lot of them are patriotic people, you know, and then, you know, I do think probably, you know, white collar crimes have like occurred, but like the core like crash retrieval stuff, I don't know how you do it differently in retrospect. Like, I don't know, you know, and again, this is all based on these kind of hypotheticals, but like I could see, you know, a lot of the just basic core legacy program and like hiding that being somewhat forgivable. And then I think a lot of, you know, the fuckery like around, you know, psyops and stuff and driving certain people crazy and, you know, that marginalizing people based on their experience, like all that's horrible.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah. And that should be, you know, addressed in like in a real way. And
that's also something your boy Grusch bravely, I think, brought up. And that's a really, you know, that stuff bothers me. That people's families should not be brought into these things and shit like that. But we've been putting it off all day. Let's go there on Grusch.
Yeah.
I just got to take a piss first.
Okay, cool.
Let's stop for 1 second and we'll be right back. All right, we're back. David Grusch.
Yeah.
So you knew him before he went public and everything. How, you know, what in the name of CIA are you doing around him?
I actually was in a venture capital context. Like I was looking at a company that was like in space. It actually had come out of Space Force. Like the guy who started it was an officer in the Space Force, and he started a company in this area. And I was diligencing it, and I was talking to him about, you know, his company. But you know, at the end of my diligence, I was like, "Hey, man, like, I'm also really into this other stuff. I'm really into the UFO thing. I know you're like, you know, you've been around the block when it comes to space." And he was like, "Yeah, like I'm a believer, but I don't know that much. Like you know, there are limits to my knowledge." And like he could tell I was deep on it. And he was like, "I have somebody you should probably meet." And so that's when he introduced me to Grusch.
What year is this?
This was, I guess, 2 years before I put out the thing in July of 23, so 21 is when I met him. Yeah.
Where'd you meet him?
I met him initially at my house. My buddy who's in the Space Force brought him over to my spot. And it was really like a trip for me because I was like, I don't know, man, you're so used to meeting like these like really like snake oily people. Mm-hmm. And like you're bringing up all sorts of things, but like, I don't know, a lot of the people in the UFO world are just like, they're just full of shit. And they just speak in these sort of like super hokey ways. And he really like broke that pattern. I was like, whoa,
what about him broke that pattern?
He's like clearly like mildly autistic. Like not, you know, all the way, but like he's a little autistic, like very high attention to detail, extreme like truth seeking, and very sincere too. And so I think, you know, all of those things combined, he just broke the pattern, you know.
Did he tell you everything that he later has told us publicly at that meeting?
Did he tell me everything that he later?
Yeah. Like, did you know all the details?
Oh, was he like, there has been a crash retrieval program? He was really high level in that first meeting. I think he was kind of sussing me out, but he was like, it hinted like, hey, I think you might be onto something. There might be more here than, you know, meets the eye. But, you know, he was still in the government at the time. So he was very cagey around what he could share. But it was clear, like, you know, when you speak to somebody, you see like the resonance in their eye. Like I'm decent at like picking cues up like that. And like, I came out still pretty like pumped because I was like, that guy like got a lot of the fringy shit I was saying. So I was like, there's some like recognition in his eyes that like I could just detect.
He's also definitely clearly a very highly intelligent guy.
Yeah,
I
you
mean,
know,
yeah.
he's become like a really good buddy, and like he's next level intelligent. He's really, really smart.
Did he hint at all in whether it was that meeting or your earliest meetings, whatever they were, did he talk about the idea that like, hey, I'm going to go public with this at some point?
Not then, but I got to know him a bit, actually decently well before he came out, and he seemed extremely frustrated at like trying to like kind of reform things from within, and it was clear at one point that like, you know, it's like he was experiencing a bunch of reprisals, basically, like, you know, blowback around his investigations. And he was like, I gotta get out. You know, I gotta go public, basically, like for his own immunity and like, so he could actually like affect any sort of change on this.
What do you mean, like he was trying to reform things from within?
I don't know the actual specifics, but my sense was that the initial strategy was like discover this stuff, bring it to the right people in charge, and then try to like engage in the proper reforms around it, like, you know, reorganize the legacy stuff, create academic programs around this. So like it's like, you know, the nuclear stuff. It's like nuclear physics should not be classified, right? But like nuclear trade secrets should be classified. Like these obvious things. And I think he was sort of trying to like affect this change from the inside. Like, hey, we're not in front of this issue at all. Like we need to be like more forward minded on this. And I think he just wasn't getting any there. I think he was sort of spinning his wheels. I think, you know, superiors and colleagues were doing all sorts of, you know, dirty things. And yeah, I think he basically was like, I got to blow the lid on this.
Did he discuss with you, and I'm going to come back to some of the specific things he said for people out there who haven't heard it, but did he discuss with you some of the threats or the fearfulness surrounding both him and his family that made like the blowback that was keeping him up at night at that time?
Yeah, he touched on it. Yeah, he was he touched on you know, I think certain shots across the bow that he and his family got that were pretty unnerving. It's unnerving obviously for him, extremely unnerving, and then unnerving for me to hear as well, because I'm like, man, we're in communication, and like I'm kind of looking into this stuff too, and you know, so yeah, it was. I think it was a very precarious time pre him coming out, because you know, you don't have immunity, nobody knows who you are, you know, and so if they're going to engage in retaliation, it was like pre-July of 23, not after. I think now it would be much harder for them to do that.
Why do you think he, minus the clear understanding of the knowledge of the subject that you had, and you know, you're a friendly guy too, why do you think he trusted you and gave you all this? And the reason I ask that is because at the time you're not a public figure, you don't have the YouTube channel, and like if you wanted to toss on a paranoia brain from his end, because obviously things were happening in his world, you're investing Peter Thiel's money, the guy who owns Palantir, you know, like you could make some conclusions there, like, why the fuck am I being walked into this guy's house? Why do you think he was like, you know what, I fuck with you, Jesse?
I think it was two things. I think it was one, like just genuine social rapport. I think, or maybe three things. Two, like a respect for how far I had gone in like open source techniques, like just like discovering a lot of this stuff on my own, where I think, yeah, you know, you should give credit where it's due, where, yeah, there are guys who are like, you know, extremely deep, like, you know, Richard Dolan, for example.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of, you know, other guys, you know, back in the day, it would have been like Stanton Friedman or Leonard Stringfield or whatever, guys who you just have to give your props to as far as like knowledge on this stuff. I think those guys are often like way stronger than me, like on like an amalgamation of facts and sightings. Like they just have more of it. I think as far as like theory, I'm pretty deep on this stuff. So I think there was like a mutual respect there, in like coming to the same conclusions. And then I think it was also kind of a trust building process where I don't know if he would have. Well, first of all, he was trying to put this out through like mainstream media initially, and the Washington Post and New York Times kind of shat the bed and didn't end up running with the story.
Why?
And so I don't
especially New York Times.
I don't know why. I think, I spoke to Leslie Kean about it because Leslie Kean broke the story for the debrief,
Yes.
but she's a New York Times staff writer.
Right.
So she wanted to do it through the New York Times. And I think, what's the guy's name? Is it Julian Barnes? Or I think it's Julian Barnes. I think they're like Intel editor or whatever, or like national security editor. Like I think he's just like kind of anti the UFO thing.
Right.
And so also I think like none of the 40 people could come forward like directly to the New York Times, and I think like they doubted that. The whole thing is actually absurd because you have colleagues of Grusch's coming out. You published the 2017 stuff. Why wouldn't you publish Grusch? First of all, that's total double standard right there. But like, second of all, you have like pretty unimpeachable colleagues of Grusch's, guys like Carl Nell, who set up Army Futures Command, and and others saying like, this guy's like legit, and defending his credentials, and then Grusch coming out and saying what he's saying. That itself is a story. And you can caveat it with whatever you want if you're the New York Times. But to me, not publishing that shows like a prima facie, a priori disinterest or bias. That's weird.
Very weird.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. You can say like, we don't know, and XYZ need to be corroborated. But you have the ICIG, Thomas Monheim, saying, this is urgent and credible. That's him. That's not you. And then you have his credentials being sort of backed up. And so I don't know. I can't answer that, like why they didn't publish it. But then I think it was this thing where he was feeling really burned by like the mainstream media, and he's like, "Oh, my friend Jesse, yeah, he has like a smaller channel, but like he's really deep on this stuff. He's high conviction on it."
Excellent episode, by the way.
Thanks, man.
That one with him.
Appreciate
really
that. Yeah, it was fun to make. That one felt like really like I don't know, it was like a beautiful moment. Like I was pumped to do it for him and for the whole kind of movement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the thing that keeps coming into my head is some of these stories I've heard from behind the scenes where Intel comes in and says, don't do that.
Yeah.
And that would, especially considering Leslie's there, like that's what I'm thinking, especially also given that he was getting reprisals behind the scenes. So people weren't happy about this.
There's clearly some sort of internal war inside the government. And I don't know if I know the exact fault lines, but it's clear there's some part of the government does not want this out. Another, really does in a limited sense and over time. There's nobody that I think is full Ed Snowden on this.
Yes.
And
we were talking about this before camera. I agree.
Yeah. So I think it's a war between those two sides. I'm definitely on the side of like, again, not knowing ontological truth or whatever and being on the outside. I'm on the side of like, I don't see any reason. I've been given no reasons outside of like these rumors you hear, guys like Jeremy Corbell or like Ross Coulthart who are like supposedly in touch with people like in and around the actual program. It's just like, they always say like, we get super deep with these people, and like they all say the same thing at the end of the conversation, which is, if you knew what I know, you wouldn't be pro-disclosure, You hear that over and over again. And so I'm not inclined to dismiss it. Like I think there's a credulousness to that world sometimes of reporting, but I also think they're doing good work, and like it's important to not throw the baby out with the bathwater and kind of parse the good from the bad. I think some of the stuff that they're bringing out is really good, and then sometimes it's a little indiscriminate at times or whatever. But
your idea though that it's like pieces of the government, certain people know certain things about certain topics, and then they don't know about these other 50 topics. Same thing for this other team over here, but they don't know about this one. You know what I mean? Like there's this compartmentalization that happens, and then maybe there's very few who are actually like individuals, literally, who are like read in on most of it. Therefore, the secret is kept in all these different places where you need all of it together to really make sense of it. And frankly, the same people who are saying, if you knew what I knew, well, they only know one piece out of the 200.
That would be my strong bias, is like you meet some of these people with like, hardcore intel credentials or whatever. And like, I just don't think like they have the epistemic ability. Like, you might have like a treasure trove of data proving that this stuff is real. Like tons of crashes here. And like, this thing was detected here and whatever. But I think that, and like, the ability to like holistically have like a worldview, like an expanded worldview, like a metaphysical understanding of reality, is like very different. And I think you can be outside the government and have clear intuitions around that, even that are even greater and more kind of top of the pyramid, so to speak. They're more kind of, there's more consilience and more interdomain knowledge and connections you're making than like the dude that like handled a thing in this one situation, or like, went through these XYZ files, and like they're sure that like reality's weirder than we realize, and that the government has some handle on it. But they don't, I don't think, have like this like clear picture of like what's going on. And that's why, I found it really interesting. There's a story, this guy, Robert Sarbacher, who, was in touch with Wilbert Smith, who is there's written correspondence between the two. Wilbert Smith is this, a Canadian engineer, and Sarbacher is this American engineer, and he's this nuclear expert. And he is running the Washington National Labs. He's close with Townsend Brown, who's doing the gravity stuff. And I think he's in on the UFO stuff too. In 1987, he writes to William Steinman, who's this UFO researcher, saying, the rumors around the UFO crashes are essentially true or substantially true or whatever. And he says, John von Neumann, Vannevar Bush were involved in these things. Like he goes on to like, list names. And maybe he was speaking in sort of coded fashion. I think he says fundamentally true or substantially true, and that can sometimes mean you're true on the surface level, but you're wrong on the underlying details or whatever. But I think he was, maybe somewhat, involved in all this stuff. And anyways, he, says he wasn't fully read into the program, but he points people who come to him again in the 80s, like, later in his life, to this guy, Eric Walker, who's an electrical engineer and the president of Penn State. And Eric Walker, according to him, was part of this like MJ-12 lineage or whatever, this like core group of UFO people. And the first thing that Eric Walker asks, the UFO, the inquirers, is he goes, "What do you know about the sixth sense?" And they say, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "What do you know about ESP, extrasensory perception?" And then he says, "You're chasing windmills." Like, it's like literally your epistemic aperture is incapable of the disclosure. It's not like disclosure is like this like semantic information. It's not like this file that he can just give you. It's like you're literally like you're chasing your tail. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Like you're like almost like not even like able to comprehend this stuff. And that's always stuck with me, because I do think it's like a knowledge on this stuff is like a drip, but it comes from something higher. It's not coming necessarily from the government or whatever. Like if you're focused on that drip, good luck. It's going to take like a long time. Yeah. You're going to get like, little bits and pieces or whatever along with everybody else over the next 10 years or whatever. But, I think developing your own epistemic aperture is like this really crucial thing in this whole story. And so, yeah, I think that's like a very telling story, that it's really about your own epistemics in some ways, more so than, yeah.
And then you have the people like Grusch, though, who have access to things and find it.
Yes.
And, what's the term? Epistemic aperture?
Yeah.
He develops his own epistemic aperture.
Well, he's a good example. He's got both. He's got, yeah. Sorry for my annoying.
I can tell you spend a lot of time around Eric Weinstein.
Yeah, exactly. I got it from him. That whole universe is a lot of it's its own lexicon of words. I think he's a good example of both. I think he has like really creative mind, and like is really strong on like theory, as well as like he clearly is like has a lot of actual hardcore info.
Well, but before I ask the next question, just for the people out there listening who need to be rehashed on some of the things he revealed or haven't heard it before, I know most people obviously have heard this. Can you just review that, like the highlights of what he revealed, and then I have a question about some of those findings.
Yeah, sure. So Grusch?
Yes.
Basically, his findings are, we have had a legacy crash retrieval program that goes back not only to Roswell, but to 1933, this Magenta crash in Italy, that basically aerospace companies have been involved in this, various aerospace companies since then. They've not always been subject to kind of traditional government oversight and FOIA. The clearance system that, classifies this stuff is the, NPQ, DOE clearance system, the atomic energy stuff, not, normal national security, top secret, TSSCI, like that sort of line is not applicable here. Some presidents don't even have a need to know. And that you have these kind of balkanized, again, corporate entities that are engaging in like trying to like reverse engineer these crafts. And he brought forward 40 people who worked on these programs to the inspector general, the intelligence community inspector general. And so those are his claims. And he claims that non-human biologics came with the crafts or piloted the crafts as well. And that the materials in the crafts contain heavy elements. So elements with isotope ratios that don't exist on Earth, but heavy elements like, in places on the periodic table where you can't use centrifuges to mess with the, the isotopes. Like, it would be extremely hard to manipulate these, if you're just a random scientist. So yeah, some pretty bombshell claims.
Yeah, a lot. So our very first phone conversation we got into this long talk about what could it, like how Grusch could be telling the truth but set up to do it. And I've talked about this on other podcasts, and I've said I really want Jesse in here to explain it from his lens because he'll explain it a lot better. But what I had asked you on the phone was like, is it possible that you have someone who is both curious and smart, like Grusch, who within the levers of government is identified as that's a dude who's going to look into some stuff if given the opportunity. Is it possible that as a part of some sort of psyop, if you will, there were a lot of nuts left on a trail for what they deem to be the Squirrel Grusch for him to pick up and run with to go out and disclose things that actually aren't true? To which you gave me an answer, the short answer of no, I don't think that. I think there's too much here. But what was the full logic there that made you go, there's too much here for that to be the case?
Yeah, well, I just knowing him and like how detail oriented and like autistically like obsessed with like detail, I think is one thing. There's a possibility like they're trying to in some super coordinated fashion sending him down the wrong path. But like I asked him that in my interview with him, like on air, in our show, and he was like, yeah, but like I had other people back channel with the people talking to me, and like those people they'd intersected with my own career from like decades prior or whatever, or a decade prior, and like they wouldn't lie to me, and they especially wouldn't, because they don't know each other, they wouldn't be able to like coordinate to that level. And so like I think that's like I asked him and he was like, I'm 99% sure that did. So like even he's thinking probabilistically 1%.
Yes.
But I don't know. I don't think that's likely. And then you have all the like Robert Hastings, like just like the UFOs and nuke stuff, where it's all the open source stuff just weirdly comports with the classified stuff. So again, if you're like a freakishly good counterintel person or whatever, and maybe you're trying to trick Grusch into tricking me or whatever, maybe you comport all of the internal stuff. You fabricate internal documents to like look like the open source stuff in a way that like, it all coheres perfectly. But
Teal's answering the phone at Palantir like, I got just the guy.
But like, it's like if you're trying to do that, then I mean, first of all, like whoever would do this, like grandmaster job, genius, yeah. Like incredible job. But I just don't see it. And I see like the amount of like disparate, it's like, take this pathway of like reasoning, right? You have Robert Hastings, UFOs and nukes. You have an extremely credible database of 170 people who do not get into this job due to any sort of histrionic attention-seeking desire for UFO, for themselves. They don't want to be famous, and UFOs keep showing up around our most precious, important assets. And every time they do, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations shows up and they threaten them and say, we're going to screw with your career and, swear them to secrecy. And in certain cases, the people get deleted from the government, like Bob Jacobs. And then their superiors later have to say they were real. Okay, so
what happened with Bob Jacobs?
They said he never worked at Vandenberg, and he's a photo instrumentation specialist there. That in '64 sees this, UFO wrapping around this dummy nuclear Atlas V warhead, and so you hear these stories over and over and over again, and then you could still say, right, like, okay, it's a credible database, like these people are really smart and high agency, but like maybe it's like still this like U.S. deep state thing, and like they like somehow like prime all the nuclear people, and like it's this, maybe that's like this pro like, trying to like make people think that we're protected by the aliens or something. By it's like orbs are showing up. I don't know. You can spin some tall tale, but then you get into the fact that there are UFO sightings in Bariloche in Argentina because there's a civilian nuclear grid there. And there's literally a town in Japan, in Ino, right in Fukushima, next to the prefecture, where they have all their nuclear energy, that is like dedicated to UFOs. And there's a museum there that's all around UFOs. And so like you hear enough of this stuff, and you're like, there is a there. I don't, like anybody that's like, this isn't worthy of investigation. I'm like, you just have like bad Bayesian reasoning. Like you have this a priori bucket that you just put like. You put this stuff into. You put it in the impossible bucket. You don't look at it. You're not looking at it earnestly. Like you didn't listen to what I just said. If you actually take in the fact pattern that I just gave, then you have to think this stuff is real. And then, is there a possibility there's some mastermind being like, and somehow atomic secrecy is overlaying this stuff, and like these scientists were involved, and the Australians also thought they were involved, and like, the magnesium bismuth is showing up here, but it's also in the Townsend Brown stuff. Like maybe, I don't know, but like, I don't know. That feels like all of a sudden, if that's your null hypothesis, the null hypothesis becomes more of a stretch, more of a logical stretch than just there's some intelligence here that's not human. That all of a sudden becomes a more epistemically acceptable base case. And actually, like what are you saying? You're saying there's some cabal that's controlling Bariloche, controlling Japan, and controlling our nuclear assets? Like, what are you actually proposing if you look at the real fact pattern? And so I don't see too many people, like if you had like Sean Kirkpatrick on, like the old head of Arrow.
Yep.
He's not like earnestly engaging with these like, nuclear cases or whatever. Like there is clearly a connection there. And so like that, that's all I need to know. There's like something clearly very, very real here. And then like all the Grusch stuff just like backs that up. It like coheres with it like pretty perfectly. And then let's like, okay, so you think it's a psyop? Like to what end? To what end is it like purely a psyop,
Purely.
Yeah. Yeah. Like maybe, there are people in this movement or whatever, in the UFO disclosure movement with ulterior motives. Maybe part of it's adversary signaling, maybe part of it's tech protection, maybe part of it's refresh the talent pool on some secret science programs. Maybe it's like, think of a whole host of things that like are ulterior motives that you're going to like push this stuff with. Having said that, just the fact pattern itself, I think is just undeniable and kind of unimpeachable. And like, that's what interests me. And like, I have a sense of some people doing some of the other stuff. I don't want to talk about it because I just want to follow the truth.
Right.
And I don't want to fuck with anybody. I think it's probably dangerous enough to be looking into like the core ontological truth stuff. And so I'm not trying to like, and to, maybe some of these psyops or some of these, ulterior motives are like, my motive is like the truth, but like I don't want to fuck with somebody having some trying to maintain American supremacy in some of these areas. Like whatever, do your thing. You're
also within the community itself. It's clear, and it comes across in this conversation, but also in your actions that I've seen online now for a long time. Like you're a peaceful truth seeker in this way. You're not trying to get in the middle of much of the bullshit drama that happens, like in UFO Twitter and stuff like that. It's about like, okay, if there's people who allegedly have access to some information here, let's hear them out. Let's talk with them. I don't care who they fuck with and who they don't fuck with. Like, it's what it is. And we need that. In order for the space to be taken seriously, we need that. And it seems like well, I think you guys straight up said it, so it's more than it seems like. You also were able to turn around your colleague Eric Weinstein into looking into this, because for a long time he was like, yo, fuck that. So what was it that really, it's not like he's out there saying, yo, the aliens are here.
Yeah.
But he's looking at it in an educated, questioning, truth-seeking way. It seems at this point. What conversation changed that? What action changed that to where suddenly he's like, all right, Jesse.
I think two things happened for him. One is he started to become more public about his physics theory of everything, the geometric unity stuff, which I think he'd presented in Oxford in like 2013. But like, you had half the people being like, this is it. And then the other half was like, I don't know what he said. And I don't, and like it, kind of like he developed it and then he went on Rogan and he sort of published it again. And I think the combo of him presenting it and like there being nobody to like corroborate or falsify it, like it's like he can't talk to anybody about this stuff. And then he starts to get into like this very interesting other angle to the UFO thing, which is like these guys like John Wheeler and Bryce DeWitt working on science that might have not met the eye. This like idea of the golden age of relativity and this kind of like, extreme interest in the gravity stuff in the 50s. And so he's like in his mind thinking, maybe I've figured some stuff out on my own, but maybe some other people have gotten there before me. Maybe there's some program around this. What's going on? And he does a whole follow-up, Rogan episode. It was not the one with Terrence Howard, the one before it, where he says some crazy things like Jim Simons of like Renaissance technologies.
Yeah, that was February 2023.
Yeah, he was like, maybe there's some secret, physics stuff going on there. You have like the number, it's the greatest concentration of differential geometers and stuff. It's like, I don't know.
The best line in there is Michikaku.
Yeah.
Michikaku is out of control.
Yeah, he goes,
and you just see Joe just, he's like, get Michikaku in here with me. And Joe's like, why?
Yeah. That's so funny. Yeah, exactly. So he says, so he is, there's a combo of like, maybe these guys have figured out some of the stuff that I've figured out.
Yeah.
And maybe there's this whole like, secret national, maybe, the physics that I've been working on has been like weaponized or something. And then there's this confluence of that and the Pentagon admitting there are things in the sky that, we don't know how to identify. And you have these two Office of Naval Intelligence reports, I think one in 2020 and one in 2021. And you have, associated mainstream media articles and press around that. And I do think, Eric's a very heterodox first principles thinker, but he also has to like walk this tightrope of like, I have to maintain a level of respectability among like academics that I'm like trying to like spar with, because he is on their level, I think, intellectually for sure, like above a lot of their level.
Yes.
And like when I hear Sean Carroll being like, oh, like he doesn't even like, I think Kurt Mungle asked him about Eric and he was like, that guy's like an amateur. He just has like pet theories or whatever. He's like throwing him in with like Brian
That's
Greene
not
and a couple
good.
other.
Yeah, you
I'm like,
shouldn't
dude,
do
just
that.
shut up. Like, what have you done? That,
You shouldn't
like,
do that.
Yeah. Like you're just like a pop quantum mechanics. I mean, he's obviously extremely smart, but you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't like condescend,
Yes.
And so anyways, I think Eric, all of that's to say, like, I think he is very first principles, but I do think there's a difference between Jesse, his podcast partner, and like venture guy at, Teal Capital,
of course,
being like, yo, UFOs are real. Like, look at this. That's different than like Pentagon, New York Times being like, we don't know what this stuff is. This stuff is real. And so I do think to his credit, he immediately credited me with like, okay, you've been pushing, like, I thought you were like brain dead in this one area. I appreciate you pushing me on this for like a long time. But I do think that allowed him to, talk about it more publicly and like really take it more seriously.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other 500-pound elephant in the room here with all these things we're seeing in the sky is something I don't think it's come up a little bit today, but not really directly. And that is, what could be weaponry that we don't know about versus everything else. I mean, for me, a major case with that, a guy as a witness who I've really liked is David Fravor. Yeah. Because he's very matter of fact. And he has the video on the screen. He's like, look, this is what I do. Yeah. This is my expertise. Yeah. This is what I saw. Yeah. It went boop, boop, boop. Yeah. I don't see Tic Tacs. I don't see shit like that doing that. Yeah. That's not something that is a part of ours that I know about. Meaning, draw your own conclusions here. I think it might be alien, but like, I don't know, is it something else? you know, you could go way too deep with this and like get out of control to things you don't know. But like, I've heard from a lot of, I guess, people who might know something about something, it's hard to say, that like DARPA, for example, could be 40 years ahead of us in technology. So when you see something like that, where it is an unidentified aerial phenomenon, right? It's not, we don't know if it's alien or not. Does your mind go towards, for some of these things, you know, maybe that is our weaponry and most likely not an adversary's, otherwise they'd have taken us over by now?
It's possible. I've heard things to that effect. I do think if you look at the actual observables of, you know, the Tic Tac, it's like, it's like just crazy maneuverability and like, you know, you're breaking basic conservation of momentum. So it is like new physics, or it's like a spoofing thing that like, but then like, how do you spoof the FLIR? And then they say they have radar. How do you spoof the FLIR, the radar, and the actual eyewitnesses?
Yeah.
That's a lot of spoofing. So then you're getting into like a crazy claim, which is like we have like physics, you know, in deep black aerospace. And so I just think that requires like a lot of follow-up and evidence.
Of course.
But yeah, I've heard certain people say that that might be the case. And I don't know what to think about it. You know, if that is the case, it's of the Townsend Brown lineage would be my belief.
Yeah. My brain also, a little conspiratorial, goes towards some of that Operation Paperclip and some of the things the Nazis were onto.
Yeah.
You know, because you basically saved like some of the worst people on the earth who just happen to be very smart.
Yeah.
At something. You brought them over here. We know some of them put us into fucking space and shit.
Yeah.
And it's like, what were they able to maneuver? You brought up a lot of amazing research today about anti-gravity and projects that were going on in the 50s and 60s.
But it starts in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you know about like Kammlerstab? Have you heard of that? So
Kammlerstab?
Yeah, have you heard Kammlerstab?
Fill me in.
So there's this SS officer named Hans Kammler. He's the most ruthless Nazi. Like Albert Speer, who was head of all armaments for the Nazis, said, you know, Hans Kammler was the most ruthless, unscrupulous guy I was forced to collaborate with. And so you're talking about a Nazi who's worked with like Hitler and Goebbels and, you know, Himmler. And he's saying that this guy is like the craziest, most ruthless guy. By 1945, Hans Kammler was in charge of all aerial armaments for the Nazis. So the V2s, A4s, everything. And he had this secret weapons program called Kammlerstab or Skoda Works. And it was based in two places, in Czechoslovakia and Poland. And so modern day, you know, obviously these were Nazi occupied. And you had these three scientists, Richard Mita, who was doing high voltage stuff, which is very similar to what Townsend Brown was doing. So, you know, similar experiments, like, you know, kind of short distances, high voltage, you know, maybe asymmetric capacitors. You had Rudolf Schreiber, who was this German technician who had a design for a flying saucer. And you had another guy named Victor Schauberger, who lived in Austria, who we know, he said in his diaries, it says, or I think it was a letter to his son, he says, I'm in Czechoslovakia and what I'm doing is top secret. And this is 1942, right after an SS officer knocked on his door. And so you have all these guys kind of, you know, being housed in like these, you know, secret weapons programs in Poland and Czechoslovakia. A lot of it is actually underground. And they're working on all sorts of crazy stuff. And Mita had a you know designs for flying saucer. All of these guys that I just mentioned had, you know, designs for flying saucer. There's another guy named Henri Coanda, who's a Romanian engineer who was also under Nazi occupation. He had a patent for a lenticular aerodyne saucer, and he, I think, also ended up contributing to Skoda Works. So Skoda Works was like a real thing, and they were working on like the most advanced weaponry at the time. And at the same time, you had, Foo Fighters, which are these controlled balls of lightning. They seemed like, they were intelligently propulsed or controlled or whatever, with no vapor trails, moving in and out of Allied fighter flight paths. And so I don't know if there's a connection between that and Skoda Works, but Skoda Works was definitely doing some really crazy stuff. I mean, the rumors were they might have been working on, flying saucer, but there are also rumors. Have you heard of Die Glocke? Do you know what that is? This legendary bell, this German bell. Have you heard of that?
Maybe.
It's this. It looks like this sort of like egg-shaped or bell-shaped, thing, and there's a ceramic chamber on the inside. It's metallic on the outside. And you use a lot, extremely high voltage energy. You create like a torsion field around this, object. You have a person go inside the object, and you slow the inertial reference frame. So gravity and time are coupled. And so if you create, the only ways to affect gravity are basically through mass and energy, right? So you have like an extremely big planet, you're going to, you have this gravitational inward force. But maybe if you have like extremely high amounts of energy, you can also create sort of like these synthetic gravitational effects, and then you can maybe mess with time as well. If you think about it, like the closer you move to a black hole, time slows. And so the idea would be you create this sort of torsion field, and you create this different inertial, this different reference frame on the inside of the bell as on the outside. And so time is actually moving slower on the inside versus the vis-a-vis the outside. And so if it's moving like 1,000th of of the pace of the outside, you can walk out of that thing, after a certain amount of time, you're 1,000 years in the future. And so it's a crazy concept. So that is the lore. That to me is the least believable thing that could have come out of Schroeder Works. But we know that, or we have some evidence that Ernest Grawitz, who is head of the SS Medical Division, that Joseph Mengele worked under Grawitz, was maybe involved in this project.
Oh boy.
As was a guy named Walter Gerlach, who was studying gravity, at his university prior to this work. And so it's this really interesting thing. This guy named Nick Cook wrote this book called The Hunt for Zero Point. And he documents it really well. And he meets this Polish journalist named Igor Witkowski, who's probably like the deepest on this. And Cook comes out saying, I don't know if this was real, but there's like a ton of evidence that like Schroeder Works was real, that you had these crazy secret weapons programs that were like, they put the concept of Wunderwaffe, like German wonder weapons, to shame. It's like next level stuff, but he doesn't know, whether the bell existed exactly or like what exactly was going on. But it's a fascinating inquiry. And there's actually a book by this guy named Tom Augustin, and I think it's called Blunder, and it's basically about how there was this fighting for the scraps of Schroeder Works in 1945. And how the Russians ended up with a lot of this stuff and a lot of the frameworks that might have come from Schroeder Works, and then the U.S. ended up with a lot of it. And originally around 45, it was thought that Kammler died or disappeared, and now we know actually from a couple of declassified documents that Kammler ended up in the U.S.
Of course he did,
and that we took him back. And so that's this like really crazy kind of, punctuation mark at the end of this story that like is very important and not super well known. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what you make of that, but I think there was a lot of tech transfer at the end of the war, and it wasn't just, you had missions like TICOM, which was, for communications, and ASOS, which is for nuclear stuff. And you had like, Werner, you had Heisenberg and stuff, like in like this like wiretapped room, like trying to figure out what he knew and stuff. That was kind of maybe like the white world nuclear stuff. The way Nick Cook puts it, you had black world nuclear stuff going on, and that was under Kammler. And so Kammler was doing, weird nuclear stuff, and then aviation stuff. The final story here, which I think is just mind blowing, because all of this is still kind of in the like lore mythological realm, but this maybe brings it down a little more, is there's a guy named John Warner IV, who's actually Chris Mellon's cousin.
Of course.
And so he comes from the Mellon family. His grandfather is Paul Mellon. So Paul Mellon is one of the founders of the CIA. And John Warner is having like a martini with Paul Mellon. And, his grandfather's like recounting all these crazy stories. And he's like, 3 or 4 martinis deep. And he says, I remember being in modern day Czechoslovakia, and I'm standing on top of a massive craft, and it's a saucer. And John Warner says, is that the one with the, a bunch of the BMW engines, like, taped it onto each other? And he goes, no. And he just like kind of changes the subject. But it was a trip that he and Alan Dulles, obviously third director of the CIA, were
Godfather of Operation Paperclip.
Yeah, it was, exactly. And Dulles was doing all sorts of crazy stuff,
dude.
like around the war. He was gone fully rogue. You know?
read Devil's Chessboard?
Yeah, I have.
Oh my God.
Yeah. What a book. Yeah, exactly. And anybody who watches the Sheehan episode I just did should read that book because it corroborates all the Sheehan stuff too. So you have a lot of weird evidence around like Nazi secret stuff. Like they might have figured out more than meets the eye, and then exactly what they figure out, I don't know. It
gets weird.
You have who is Werner von Braun's? Why am I blanking on his name? Werner von Braun's mentor, Herman Oberth.
Yeah,
he ends up at Convair Bell, Convair, doing interesting stuff. And then von Braun obviously ends up here. It's runs our space program. He and Arthur Rudolph, who like literally ran the German space, they created the VT rocket.
Yeah.
Like they're like running like the NASA Saturn program. Like it's literally like that NASA Saturn program is like a transplantation of like the Nazi space program. It's like pretty fascinating.
The three-way race for resources after World War II and the immediate aftermath and the years after that between Russia, the United States, and Britain, and the secrets of the world that exist from that race is one of the most underreported great mysteries of our time.
Yeah.
It's just the depth. I mean, you get into the biological weapons stuff too.
Yeah,
you get into, you start to wonder, like, how did these guys not have a Manhattan Project and not get to that? And and this is pure crazy speculation on my part, but sometimes I do wonder if within those evil, sadistic little Nazi brains of theirs, apparently weren't that little because they knew some science, but like you get the point.
Yeah.
If like maybe they had gotten to something like that, like a nuke. Maybe they had gotten to some insane biologics.
Yeah.
And they had just enough left of whatever lack of humanity they had.
Yeah.
To say, maybe we shouldn't give it to the stash. That motherfucker's a little crazy.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think about that a lot because the shit that they were onto.
Yeah.
And then the deals they were able to make. And let's be honest, the Dulleses had some sympathies, if you will, towards the Nazis. That's very well documented long before the war, and then when the war was closing off, obviously.
Yep.
But like, if that was a part of it, I would, oh my God, I would love to be a fly on the wall during some of those years, or a fly on the fucking Humvees as they pulled up on shit and tried to figure out what the fuck to do here, because there's some crazy stuff that came out.
Yeah, well, you also just look at, even more prosaically, like, look at the fighter jets, and then look at the rocket. Like the VT rocket was like 20 years ahead of like anything coming out of the U.S. Like the Nazis, I don't know if this is like a pro border science argument because there are no like moral qualms about like looking into all sorts of. I think there was like experimental cell block 9 where they were like doing human experimentation on like Mengele doing like weird twin. All this stuff is so fucked up. It's so messed up.
It's crazy.
And so I don't know if they just made progress because they were so like psychologically like unbound and like just down for like whatever.
Right. No, like, it's a valid question.
But it's interesting. Like it calls up a lot of questions. Like how did they make that much progress that quickly? Because so much came out of that time.
Yeah.
And you could just say that's what war creates. But the amount of progress was like, it was next level compared to. I mean, now it's nothing close to that. It's at least as far as like physical world progress.
Fuck yeah, man.
And then it's obviously towards like a super ruthless evil, and
that's the start of some weird shit that then is used on our end, which is just like, morally, that's like one of the ultimate quandaries. But we could go down a huge rabbit hole with that. I know I got to get you out of here soon. This has been awesome today.
Yeah, man.
One last thing before we go. It's come up intermittently today. Your Danny Sheehan sit down.
Yeah.
He's gonna be coming in here thanks to you.
Hell yeah.
But like, what do you make of that guy? Because he's been involved. To the title of your YouTube video, he's been involved in like every American conspiracy, and like you did such a good job with him, but you're just sitting there and you'd ask like something that's getting towards something crazy where you're like, he's not going to say something on this, and he goes, well, as a matter of fact, I was actually there for that one. I know exactly who killed Kennedy.
Yeah.
Like how do you even respond to shit like this? Like, is it crazy, or do you? It sounds like there's a lot of evidence he has below stuff.
That's the thing. So I would if I were to hear what he said 5 years ago or 10 years ago, like basic American history, Jesse, or whatever, coming at it, Columbia, whatever, American history, I would have been like, this dude's crazy. He's off his rocker. And then you read a book like Devil's Chessboard.
Yeah.
What was that? David Talbot?
David Talbot, that's right.
And like I met Oliver Stone once and like spent a little bit of time with him and like, watch that, his movies.
Jesse, you're trying to make this podcast go all night, bro.
My point is like you build up, we could go all night. You build up this like gestalt view of like, all right, like I'm pretty sure like Dulles like came after Kennedy. Like the guy hated him. He wanted to scatter the CIA to the wind. He had just fired Dulles. He had the Bay of Pigs. You come out like not knowing the motive, the chronology, and the people, but like knowing that like JFK was probably like an inside job, And then you hear
probably.
You gotta think probabilistically, but yeah.
You're saying 99.99999% probably?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay,
Yeah.
Just making sure.
Same probability that we're not alone.
Right.
You think, probably. And then you meet a guy like Sheehan, and again, I would disbelieve it if he weren't plugging in gaps in a framework that I already basically believe in. But he's like, it's like it was Dulles, but it was like this recommissioned S4. His whole his narrative's insane. It's this idea that like Nixon, who was VP under Eisenhower, but was also kind of running a lot of national security for him, kind of commissions Howard Hughes, to create this S force, which is this like team of assassins to kill Fidel Castro and Che Guevara.
And they brought in the mob too. They brought in Roselli and Giancana.
Exactly. Yeah. Trafficante, all these people who like are expedient allies because they, want the Batista drug run, back up and running or whatever. And then this S-Force gets like kind of sunsetted and then like rolled up into these other operations, Mongoose and Fox something, I don't know, whatever. And then when Dulles gets fired by JFK, he retreats back into the Brown Brothers Harriman, which is the investment firm that like sort of formed the CIA.
Yep.
And he then calls the shot that like the S-Force is going to get recommissioned.
Sleeper cell, let's go.
And to take out JFK. And he like, Danny mentions the name of the guy that he thinks he gets. It's
so he's like, Ricardo, it was Miguel.
Well, he goes, Ricardo. No, this guy Morales. They called him Roger Morales. He goes, Ricardo Morales. I don't know. But it's wild. And so again, I would not believe it if it weren't like so in line with my prior understanding of what had happened, which is that, come on, like it's like you have all these things like the magic bullet, the idea that like Jolly West, like MK Ultra, like Jack Ruby right afterwards. Like you literally can look at the JFK thing for like 5 hours and be like, I think there's some weird shit here,
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it's wild, man. Sheehan's he's like a national treasure. I don't understand how after that interview, I asked, I was like, dude, how are you alive? And he was
Jesse.
He was like, you can't be paranoid and you got to just do your thing. I mean, I don't know.
You're going to kill this hair?
Yeah. He's a little Yoda hair. Yeah.
Oh my God. I can't wait to do that.
He's the best, man. You're going to have an awesome time with him. And yeah, I'm fired up. You get to pick his brain. He's the best.
And he reps Lue Elizondo. In the past, he reps Stephen Greer. He was like early in the 90s, I think, like into UFO litigation somemew.
Well, he
always ends up somewhere.
Yeah, he's like Zelig or something. Yeah. He's always like
the Forrest Gump of law.
He's literally Forrest Gump of like American history. Yeah. And in the most interesting, like, it's crazy. Like, yeah, it's like, and then James McCord hit me up after Watergate, and like I represented him. Like, what? Yeah,
met him at a Dunkin' Donuts, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, it's wild, man. He's funny, and I don't know how he pieces all this stuff together. He has a JFK infographic that will literally blow your mind. It's like you'll come out more confused than like, it's like the amount of names and like, it's like a web of, he's like, oh, just look at my infographic. And I look at it and I'm like, am I supposed to understand this? Like the infographics are supposed to be like, 4 or 5 boxes. Right. And like, it's like, it was like 100 different things. I was dying.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.